people who lead our educational institutions. We will ask these leaders to share issues facing our educational institutions now and in the future. Today, I have with me Dr. Libby Cohen with Raise Your Hand, Texas. I would like Dr. Cohen to introduce herself, tell us what she does, and how she became interested in the work of Raise Your Hand, Texas. Welcome, Dr. Cohen.
Hi, Peter.
Hi. Tell us who you are and what you do.
Terrific. Well, thank you so much for having me today. I am the Director of Advocacy with Raise Your Hand, Texas. I have been in this role now for just about 3 years. And it's my job to work with people from all across the state to impact what happens with respect to public education during the legislative session here in Austin. So I am a native Texan. I originally grew up in Dallas. And before joining Raise Your Hand, I was working as a community organizer on the East Coast. So my real passion is for getting everyday people involved and influencing political processes. So I was really excited when the Raise Your Hand opportunity came knocking to be able to come back home, broadly speaking, and work on an issue just as important to the future of Texas as public education is.
So I've been following Raise Your Hand Texas for at least the last 7 years. I'm with Communities in Schools, so many of the issues that you work with have been things that I've been following. So, but for our audience right now, what I'd like you to do is really tell us where Raise Your Hand Texas came from and what your core mission is.
Yeah.
All right, thank you.
And is kind of a unique organization. We were founded in 2006 by Charles Butt of H-E-B Grocery, and we continue to be completely funded by Mr. Butt. And we really exist to strengthen Texas public education, both through practice and through policy and legislation. So we're a hybrid 501c3 and 501c4 organization, which is kind of unusual and really cool to have sitting under one roof. So we're appreciative that our policy work can really be grounded in kind of a unique way in what we're learning and observing on the foundation side, on the practice side of the organization. We have always maintained a really strong lobbying presence in the Capitol and have really outstanding policy expertise on our staff. What is a little bit new for us, what was part of my job when I came on board, was to take the opportunities for legislative engagement and really stretch those beyond the Capitol, figure out what we could do, how we could create opportunities for folks across the state to join us in this work. And I think it's important that people know that part of the desire to do this was because our team, our leadership, realized that we really needed all of those voices from around the state to do the ambitious things for public education that we wanted to be able to do, and that were really important to Charles. So our grassroots work is not necessary. It's not coming from just a sort of, wouldn't it be nice to have more people involved? It's because we really, really need voices from all across the state to make the difference for public education that we all want to see. So I wanted to touch briefly on sort of our vision of advocacy and how we think about kind of the rhythm of our advocacy work. Yes, the legislative session is kind of game time. It's when the big decisions happen, and it's what a lot of our work sort of builds up to. But advocacy is a continuous process that for state politics here in Texas kind of happens on a 2-year cycle that you can think of. I sort of think of it as actually beginning as soon as one session ends. So what happens now in the interim is a time for learning about issues, learning about the things that are important to education stakeholders, developing relationships. And then the first big advocacy kind of event of the calendar are primary elections, when we have opportunities to start getting to know candidates, to start elevating the visibility of particular issues. Then we have another little bit of time before we get to general elections, where of course we get to do that on an even bigger scale. And then we have just a short couple of months between general elections and the beginning of a legislative session to really do that initial communication with lawmakers and kind of expectation setting about what we hope to see happen, what people in education want to see happen over the course of a legislative session. And then, of course, legislative sessions go for 140 days every 2 years. So those kind of the event timeline that we work on. And in terms of the substance of that work, as you see here, we educate people on both issues that are at play, but also just the dynamics of the legislative process and where those moments and opportunities exist for them to share their perspective, use their voices, influence the outcomes. We create different opportunities for actually engaging, so expressing their views or support for public education, yes, during the session, but also, as I referenced, during those critical moments like elections, and in that just kind of general time where we're able to build relationships with lawmakers during the interim. And then, yes, that finally does lead to activation towards actually taking really specific advocacy steps at specific moments during the session to try and get our priorities across the finish line. So that's a little bit about Raise Your Hand, as well as what we do specifically here in the advocacy side of the shop.
Thank you so much. That's so comprehensive, and we are Texas is very blessed to have you. I love the process of recognizing that it's not just the 140 days, but it is a full 2-year cycle that you're constantly working on this, because at the chamber and through the work that we do, we recognize that. But you mentioned game time. So because we just got through with this last legislative session, which is game time, I'd like you to really give us some of the highlights of the legislative session. What were the major wins?
Well, before we can talk about sort of what happened in the legislative session, for this one in particular, we really have to talk about what led up to the session. So I think I've got a slide here, yes, that shows just some of the key events that took us to January. Rewind, go all the way back. Of course, March 2020 is the beginning of the COVID-19 shutdown. Like so many businesses and public places, schools have to flip overnight towards doing the work of education virtually, entirely virtually. And I don't know about you and your workplaces. I know at Raise Your Hand, we definitely went through a period, I was going to say a few weeks, it was probably more like a couple months of uncertainty and trying to figure out what this remote work could look like and how we could still be as effective and productive without coming into our office, without being together. Schools had to do the same thing, but with almost no ramp up period. They had to oftentimes it was just after that spring break week, figure out how they were going to try and deliver quality education just right from jump. So a really huge effort from schools and from educators. What we know, though, is that despite everyone's really sincere efforts and hard work, we experienced inevitable learning loss starting with that shutdown period. And then as it extended throughout sort of the COVID-19 crisis, whether it was because of the abrupt shift to virtual learning or because of all the challenges that students and teachers were facing at home and trying to cope with while also doing the work of learning. So that was really important coming into the session, that there'd been this unprecedented event that led to significant struggles, mental health, emotional well-being struggles, and then also academic struggles for so many of our students. So what was the legislature going to do about that was a huge question. Other things to be aware of, the shutdown, of course, also had tremendous economic implications. And especially during the summer and fall leading into the session, there were a lot of concerns that there would be significant budget shortfalls that were going to make doing things like just protecting the historic gains in school funding that were made in the 2019 session, that were going to make even just keeping those in place really, really hard. So there was a lot of anxiety and uncertainty going into the legislative session about what the overall budget picture would look like and how education would sort of fit into that. And then, very important, we had an election, as we always do, going into a legislative session. What I would note about this one that was important for the dynamics of this legislative session is that there had been a lot of expectations about the extent to which the Texas House specifically might continue to shift in balance between Republicans and Democrats. There was talk that Democrats might even flip the House. As it turned out, after Election Day, not only did the House not flip, no gains were made. The Republican and Democrat split was exactly the same. I mentioned that Raise Your Hand's a nonpartisan organization, but I mentioned that to say that was a significant political dynamic as we moved into the legislative session, that there had been these expectations of a shift that didn't happen, which were empowering for the majority party to then think about which issues they wanted to really focus on during the legislative session. So all of that was really important. And then a couple kind of key things happening at the federal level. There were these big influxes of money through federal legislation that were general COVID relief packages, but that had a lot earmarked for Texas public schools. And what was going to happen to those federal dollars, billions of federal dollars that were earmarked for Texas public schools, was one of those other big questions as we went into the legislative session. So a lot of challenges, a lot of uncertainties, but where we landed was actually in a pretty good place considering everything that happened. So these were really Raise Your Hands priorities for the legislative session. This is not a comprehensive list of what happened with respect to public ed this session, but not only were we able to maintain House Bill 3, those gains from 2019, eventually we were able to secure the release of those federal stimulus dollars to go to districts with very few strings attached to be able to address student needs and learning loss and start accelerating learning. Important for Raise Your Hand as well, that I'll just briefly note, opposing vouchers was the issue that this organization was really founded on. It was one of our kind of signature issues and interests, that we keep public dollars in public schools with a full system of public accountability. All voucher efforts that surfaced in the legislature were again roundly rejected. So important to this organization as well as many education advocates across the state. The last thing that I'll note briefly is that there were significant pushes to reduce our emphasis on standardized tests. We saw that those pushes got some traction in the House and then failed in the Senate. And I think that will continue to be an important just sort of dynamic and issue that keeps bubbling up in future sessions. So that's kind of an overview of where we landed. Major win to dig a little deeper into those federal stimulus funds. This was certainly where we spent the bulk of our time as Raise Your Hand, and this is undoubtedly the win of the session for public schools and for public education advocates. So all told, a little over $15 billion is headed school districts' way for those districts to spend over the next 3 to 4 years to help with pandemic recovery. Just under $2 billion is also at TEA, the Texas Education Agency. We're still sort of learning and coming to understand what exactly the agency intends to do with their share of the federal funds to also support COVID recovery and accelerate learning. And out of all the federal funds available, just over $2 billion did end up getting swapped or supplanted is kind of the budgetary term that we use for it, to support other portions of the state budget. And we were really concerned, as were many education advocates, that number was going to be a lot bigger. So the fact that it was only $2 billion out of this whole pot was really significant win. And then just briefly in terms of what, I think on the next slide, we have a little bit of detail about what those federal funds could be used for. This is really intended to be comprehensive help for students and for districts. So again, both figuring out if there are methods of instruction or curriculum that can help to accelerate learning. There are a number of districts that are going to be hiring more instructional staff to do more small groups and pullouts. We know that, again, the emotional and mental health toll on students and families has been significant. These dollars can go toward hiring social workers and counselors, as well as doing facility upgrades in HVAC systems, that sort of thing that, yes, could help with the transmission of any virus like COVID-19, but could also help with seasonal things like colds and the flu, things that take students out of school every year really predictably. So that could be helpful going forward as well.
Thank you so much. I want to say thank you to you on behalf of the Chamber, because so many of the priorities you had really mirror the Clear Lake Area Chamber of Commerce priorities. And so you were behind all of our priorities. Thank you for that. These are some really great wins for education. I'd like you to now spend a little bit of time. We have about 12 minutes left, but what were some of the obstacles in your advocacy throughout this session? You did some really creative things, and I want you to talk a little bit about that. What were some of the obstacles, and how'd you overcome them?
Yeah, well, every session there are the challenges of just lawmakers have limited bandwidth, and how are you going to get some of that bandwidth focused on your issue? But this session, that was magnified tenfold for a number of reasons. We had all the challenges of a legislature trying to operate under COVID restrictions, so not doing the same kind of meeting in person. Committee hearings look different, testifying look different. We had the newness and uncertainty of a new Speaker of the House and a new Public Education Committee chair. Anytime those important roles turn over, there's just a lot of uncertainty and, frankly, learning curves that have to happen as you just have new people and new jobs figuring out how to do them. And then we had a historic winter storm and power grid failure, just as things were kind of getting rolling in February, creating another crisis that lawmakers had to respond to. So you layer in on top of that the fact that This ended up also being a session dominated by really hot button social issues that got a lot of media play. And our big challenge was, how do you get lawmakers to just focus and pay attention to these billions of dollars of federal funds, but that there's a narrative around them that somehow they're really complicated and we can't figure out how to flow them. And so, oh my gosh, if it's so complicated, I just don't even have the bandwidth as a legislator to engage with that when I have so many other things on my plate. So what we did to try and kind of cut through the noise was create an explainer device of what a strong school recovery would look like and what supporting a strong school recovery would look like. And we used a three-legged stool for that. Everyone knows about, three-legged stools and how you need all three legs of a stool for it to stand and be functional. And we said the three legs of a strong Texas school recovery referred to three different financial pieces. One was preserving House Bill 3, those 2019 gains. Second was holding districts harmless for pandemic-related enrollment declines. And the third was kind of the biggest. What were these federal stimulus dollars? But once you've created a message, you still have to deliver a message. It doesn't just deliver itself. So what we did was build a whole advocacy day in April, where Capitol was just starting to open up a little bit more, where we delivered this three-legged stool message to lawmakers in every kind of medium and format that we could come up with. So every lawmaker got one of those individual miniature stools. There was a giant 6-foot-tall three-legged stool that took up residence in a really heavily trafficked part of the Capitol. We had student performances in front of the Capitol that involved three-legged stools. We had a whole art installation and video in our front window, really just trying to bring the message home to lawmakers that this was important and this was doable, this was achievable. And I'm really proud of this work. And I think this is the kind of creative and inclusive advocacy that Raise Your Hand, I hope, is really becoming known for and continues to be known for going into the future. So we had these three-legged stool efforts. We sent the three-legged stool on a tour of the state, the giant three-legged stool, which was amazing. But more important, really, than any of our individual efforts were the collective voices that got involved in this issue all across the state. So part of our work also involved at key moments on budget night or in front of key committee hearings, sending out action alerts and asking people to email or call their legislators about these really important funding issues, and had really robust engagement. And that really so much more critical than any one organization, no matter how creative or catchy that organization's messaging may be, so much more important to lawmakers that they're hearing from their constituents and getting that strong message delivered from back home about what's important to people. So this is also my opportunity to say a big thank you to all the folks who responded to one of our action alerts or who picked up the phone and called or sent off an email, really at any point during the session to their legislators on education issues. We definitely couldn't have secured these funds and had as good a session as we did without your help.
That's awesome. Thank you. I was so impressed with the creativity of that. It was fantastic. So thank you for that. And again, thank you, because it worked. We got that third leg. So thank you so very much. Now, you mentioned earlier that this is a 24-month cycle time frame. So now that the legislative session is over with, what's next? Tell us what we need to be doing as people who really believe in education.
Right. So sessions end, but politics does not. So it is important to stay engaged. A couple things. One, it was hard work securing these federal relief dollars, but the much, much harder work is now actually putting them to use in our school districts, and is the work that superintendents and educators are going to be doing to really try and get students back on track after an incredibly challenging stretch of time. We're going to learn a lot from how these dollars are deployed, and we should be paying attention to that. So we should be tracking and understanding the impact of these dollars and how they can support students and support strong academic outcomes in our districts. In terms of Raise Your Hands work and kind of the issues that we're looking ahead to, I mentioned that there were some efforts to reduce testing over in the House that failed in the Senate. Raise Your Hand believes we really need to step back and comprehensively reimagine how we are approaching school district accountability and assessment. That's a conversation that we want to really put a lot of energy into this interim over the next 18, 19 months as we're getting ready for the 2023 session. Bring a lot of voices to that table, really understand what the best forms of 21st century accountability look like, and how those can be responsive to community needs, to employer needs, and how we can tailor assessment tools to reflect those as well. So that's going to be a big effort of Raise Your Hands in the coming months. And as I said, stay engaged because this process does not end. So if you're interested in engaging with us, we've got a QR code up there that will take you to sort of a landing page and give you a number of different options to connect with our organization. I should mention that we have a team of regional advocacy directors who are stationed all across Texas. Connecting with them is a great way to get involved in our work. We're in the process of hiring one for the Gulf Coast area, but we'll be excited to announce them hopefully end of July, beginning of August. So definitely follow us on social media if you want to make sure to get that announcement. And then finally, whether or not you choose to sort of do your advocacy with us in coordination with Raise Your Hand, just still dashing off that email to a legislator, picking up the phone and calling their office to say, hey, I really appreciate the way that you supported public education this session. It means so much for them to hear those messages of affirmation and support so that we can hopefully continue to build on that in future sessions.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate you being here. Dr. Libby Cohen with Raise Your Hand Texas. If you missed the QR code, you can go to ryht.org to get more information on Raise Your Hand Texas. They're doing some fabulous work, and we are truly blessed to have them with us. As a reminder, please call your legislators and thank them for the work that they did on public education. Very, very important to the process. Thank you again, Dr. Cohen. Appreciate it. Raise Your Hand Texas. And thank you, viewers, for joining us today. Please mark your calendar for our next Education Connections on July 8th. Thank you for all your support of education. One more time, thank you, Raise Your Hand Texas and Dr. Libby Cohen.